Hello, and welcome to Reflections on Film. In this video, I'll be talking about Joker, the 2019 film directed by Todd Phillips, written by Scott Silver and Todd Phillips, and starring Joaquin Phoenix. I'm going to analyze the opening scene and talk about how it might represent some of the central themes at work in the film. Todd Phillips recently released a breakdown of this opening scene through Vanity Fair, and in it he describes a lot of the work done to capture the characters' emotions in these opening moments, and how this scene sets the mood for the film, but doesn't go into too much detail about how it relates to the overarching themes at work. And that's what I want to do in this video. Luckily, most of the opening scene is included in the Vanity Fair video, so we can use those images for reference. If you want to see the director's breakdown of the scene, check out the link in the description below. Now, I know that at the time of releasing this video, Joker is still in theaters, and many people haven't had a chance to see it yet. Taking that into consideration, I'm going to do my best to avoid giving out any specific details about the film's plot. That being said, I will be talking about how details from this opening scene relate to thematic elements which develop throughout the rest of the film. So if you don't want any indication of how the events of the film play out, or don't want to know any of the ideas explored in the film, I'd suggest pausing the video now and coming back after you've had a chance to see it for yourself. Alright, so with that spoiler warning out of the way, let's break down the opening scene of Joker and talk about how it might act as a microcosm for the film's larger narrative. The film opens with the shot of a middle-aged man sitting at a mirror, painting clown makeup on his face. In a wide shot, we see him sitting alone, apart from another group of people socializing. We move to a close-up and see that he's wearing a somewhat distant look as he attempts to force a smile onto his face. The forced expression fades before he forces himself to frown. He then places his fingers in his mouth and stretches his face into a distorted smile. Then he pulls his fingers down and his face transforms into an exaggerated frown. He then pulls his fingers back up into the shape of a smile, but he doesn't stop pulling at the limits of his skin and muscles. He keeps pulling to the point that he's obviously causing himself pain. In a beautiful and haunting moment, his face transforms from that of a somber middle-aged man into the manic and terrifying visage of the Joker. He holds this on his face as long as he can, until a tear falls down his cheek. His fingers slip from the corners of his mouth, and the scene ends. Alright, there's a lot to unpack here, but ultimately what I think we're seeing is a representation of a desperate man struggling to overcome the symptoms of a debilitating mental illness. However, he's isolated and alone, a detail highlighted by Phillips in the Vanity Fair video. And despite showing the willingness to suffer intense pain in order to overcome his symptoms, he's so isolated that he can't do it. Instead, the continued suffering and the ever-increasing desire to escape that suffering corrupts and transforms the man. He becomes the embodiment of that corruption. He becomes the Joker. Ultimately, what leads me to believe that this is what we're seeing is this symbol of a man who is unable to smile. That inability to smile seems to me like a metaphor for psychological depression. This is reinforced by the distant, somber look on the man's face. He's not happy. The stretching of his face to the point of feeling intense pain represents his struggle to force a smile onto his face, or in essence, to try and force himself to feel happy in spite of his mental illness. He cannot overcome the illness and its symptoms by himself, and in the absence of any support, he reaches a breaking point where tears begin to stream down his face, representing the ultimate corruption of his mental state. I absolutely love how, in this moment, the actor is fighting through real pain to realize this haunting image of the classic Joker smile. This image is reminiscent of the Joker's earliest comic book appearances, and imagery from The Man Who Laughs, the film upon which the Joker's original design was based. I was blown away by the performance and direction of this entire opening scene. In a matter of moments, with only a few actions, the filmmakers brilliantly encapsulate what I believe to be the ultimate theme of the film's narrative: an exploration of how corruption arises within society when the institutions of that society decay to the point that it can no longer meet the needs of its population. In this case, the needs of mentally ill individuals. I know that might seem like a big leap to make based on a description of one brief scene, but in order to talk about this more in depth, without getting into Joker's spoilers, let's talk about how this type of narrative manifests itself in other films, specifically within the genre of crime films, to which Joker absolutely belongs. Many films about crime, dating back to the early gangster films, look at crime as a manifestation of corruption within a society, and in a way they try to explain how and why that corruption arises. The explanation typically relies on the acceptance of the idea that over time social institutions will inevitably decay, as members of that society will never be able to fully maintain those institutions. This inevitable decay is coupled with the understanding that certain characteristics of a society inevitably produce unequal outcomes, producing a segment of the population which suffers the negative consequences of that inequality. Crime is then seen as the corruption that results when that segment of the population is unable to receive the necessary support from social institutions because those institutions have decayed to the point that they are no longer effective. I think the most common social characteristic that this type of narrative is framed around is poverty. Poverty is an inevitable result of any economic system, and when social institutions aren't able to provide the opportunities for those living in poverty to improve their position in life, inevitably some members of that population will turn to crime as a means of survival or advancement. A classic example of this is the 1931 film Little Caesar, the story of an impoverished immigrant who's desperate to escape that poverty. However, social decay has left him no legitimate pathways to success, and so he turns to crime, and this corruption flourishes as he climbs the ranks of a criminal empire. Maybe the most well-regarded example of this kind of narrative comes from the Godfather franchise, specifically parts 1 and 2. These films use a similar juxtaposition between poverty and the decay of social institutions, but also focus on certain ideals of the American dream as being characteristics of society which might lead to the rise of not just corruption in the form of criminal behavior, but systemic corruption in the form of a codified system of criminal behavior built on a specific set of socially corrosive moral principles. Essentially, the story of The Godfather is that of a corrupted realization of the American dream. The Corleones are an impoverished immigrant family who are desperate to pull themselves out of that low-class status. With no legitimate means of success available, they turn to crime, but that criminal behavior is fueled by a sense of purpose, a sort of justification arising from the notion that Americans are innately rebellious and will pull themselves up by their bootstraps when faced with adversity. and thus their criminal behavior is internally justified by a corrupted interpretation of a social norm, leading to the institutionalization of that corruption in the form of organized crime. This is reinforced as we see the story of the Corleone family's rise to power contrasted with the rise of the American Empire. So how does all this relate to Joker? Well, I think Joker is a crime film which places mental illness at the center of the discussion around the means by which corruption might arise in society. Any large society will inevitably have within its population a large subset of people suffering from mental illness. If the social institutions that are put in place to protect and provide opportunities for those suffering from mental illness decay to the point that they become totally ineffectual, the result will inevitably be the rise of corruption in the form of increasingly more frequent criminal behavior. One thing I find interesting about this approach is that it truly localizes this idea of corruption to a single person's experience. What the film explores is one man's struggle to overcome a specific set of symptoms brought on by mental illness, coupled with the inability of social institutions to provide support for that individual on any level whatsoever. The result isn't just a corruption of some of that individual's behavior. The result is the fundamental corruption of the individual's understanding of right and wrong. By the end of the film, this man truly becomes the Joker. He truly becomes corruption incarnate. I really think this is an important narrative, and I want to take this opportunity to encourage anyone watching this to go out and see Joker. Please support this film in the theater. I say that because I believe its narrative exposes us to essential wisdom about the need to provide security to the least fortunate members of society in order to ensure that society as a whole might progress in the best way possible. It makes use of a narrative structure that looks at corruption as an inevitable result of social progress. A narrative structure that has fascinated filmmakers and has reemerged in the stories they've told for more than a century, but which can be traced back even farther than that. The earliest known narratives in human history describe the same sort of relationship between social stability and the rise of corruption from within. Take, for instance, the ancient Egyptian myths, which recognized Osiris as the god representing rulership and progress, essentially representing the head of a well-functioning society. In opposition to Osiris is Set, the malevolent force of chaos which rose up from the social structure to try and overthrow Osiris. This narrative structure is one that human civilization has returned to time and time again to try and make sense of and ultimately put a stop to the corruption we observe in our lives. I believe Joker is a particularly powerful modern reproduction of this narrative because it's perfectly adapted to address an important crisis which we have observed in contemporary times. That being the substantial increase in the number of violent and homicidal incidents perpetrated by individuals suffering from mental illness. Ultimately, Joker is a cautionary tale, which is begging society to recognize and provide for the needs of the mentally ill. It says that if we don't address the issue, these violent outbursts aren't going to stop. The corruption will continue to fester and grow until we as a society decide to take the necessary steps to prevent it. And that's where I think I'm going to wrap up this discussion of Joker. This film had a powerful impact on me, so I'm going to take this opportunity once again to encourage anyone seeing this video to go check out this movie, and if possible, support it while it's still in theaters. I saw this movie on opening night, and I was a little bit shocked because the theater wasn't sold out, and the Joker's one of the most iconic comic book characters ever created. so the idea that this screening wasn't well attended scared me a bit, and even more so after the film ended because, like I said before, I think this is an important film that bears essential wisdom. And I'm worried that because it's not an action film, people aren't going to support it. I hope I'm wrong, and I hope that positive word of mouth will help this film find its audience while it's still in theaters. Because if it does, then we might get more films like it. More films that take comic book iconography and use it to produce meaningful and socially relevant narratives. The type of narratives that can shape our understanding of the human experience and ultimately change the way we move forward as a society for the better. Once again, this has been Reflections on Film, and as always, thanks for watching.